By the time you reach this point in the series, you have built a chain of incident skills that depend on each other, and that chain is exactly what pressure tries to break. Reporting depends on clear thinking, remediation depends on evidence, closure depends on discipline, and process improvement depends on honest reflection that turns into real change. When stress is high, people do not rise to the level of their intentions. They fall to the level of their practiced recall. That is why spaced retrieval matters here, because these topics are not just facts you want to recognize on a test. They are decisions and language patterns you need to produce quickly, accurately, and consistently when the situation is noisy. This review episode is about assessment, tracking, and retrieval practice specifically for reporting, remediation, closure, and process improvement, because those are the phases where teams often relax too early or get sloppy because the emergency feeling starts to fade. The goal is to train your memory to hold on to the most important distinctions and habits so you can apply them reliably, even when the incident is long, exhausting, and full of competing priorities. Spaced retrieval works best when you practice pulling concepts out in the form you actually use, which for incident work is usually short explanations, decision rationales, and careful language choices. For reporting, you might practice recalling what makes an executive summary useful, such as focusing on impact, actions, status, and what is known versus what is still being assessed. For remediation, you might practice recalling the difference between immediate protective actions and deeper fixes tied to root cause. For closure, you might practice recalling what closure criteria really mean, like evidence of containment, validation of trust, and documented residual risk. For process improvement, you might practice recalling the idea that you should reduce friction, increase speed, and raise quality without adding unnecessary bureaucracy. The power of retrieval is that it reveals what you cannot reliably produce without hints. Under stress, if you cannot produce a clear explanation quickly, you are likely to either overshare, oversimplify, or guess. Retrieval practice turns that fragile knowledge into dependable performance. Assessment and spaced retrieval should be designed around the weak points that show up most often in these phases of incident work. One weak point is narrative drift in reporting, where people start telling the story differently as time passes and memory changes. Another weak point is remediation drift, where teams do only the easy fixes and leave the systemic gaps untouched. Another weak point is premature closure, where services are restored and everyone assumes the incident is over without evidence-based closure criteria. Another weak point is improvement drift, where everyone agrees improvements are needed, but nothing actually gets completed after normal work returns. Your assessment prompts should force you to confront these weak points directly, such as asking yourself how you would describe uncertainty in a report without sounding evasive, or how you would document a decision rationale so it holds up later. Assessment is not about perfect answers. It is about finding where your thinking becomes fuzzy, because fuzzy thinking is exactly what pressure amplifies. If you can identify fuzziness early, you can train it out before it matters. Tracking is what turns assessment into progress, because without tracking you are only practicing feelings, not outcomes. In this part of the course, tracking should include both correctness and stability, meaning whether you can produce the right ideas consistently across multiple sessions. For example, can you explain reporting layers, from executive summary to technical detail, in a way that stays consistent, or does your explanation change each time you try? Can you separate confirmed facts from hypotheses reliably, or do you slip into certainty language when you feel rushed? Can you describe closure criteria without defaulting to uptime as the main indicator, or do you forget validation and residual risk? Can you explain process improvement as targeted changes based on evidence, rather than vague goals? Tracking can be simple, such as noting whether you needed hints, whether you missed key points, and whether your phrasing stayed disciplined. Over time, you want to see fewer missed points and less variability, because variability often signals weak understanding. The idea is to build a stable mental model that you can reproduce when the incident is demanding. A strong retrieval set for reporting should focus on creating a report that is useful, defensible, and audience-aware. You can practice recalling the purpose of the executive summary, which is to give leaders a truthful, decision-ready view of the incident without unnecessary technical mechanics. You can practice recalling what belongs in the incident narrative, like a timeline anchored in evidence, not a story built from assumptions. You can practice recalling how to describe scope and impact separately, because that distinction prevents misinterpretation and helps leaders prioritize. You can practice recalling how to document decisions and rationale, so the report explains why actions were taken based on what was known at the time. You can also practice recalling how to keep the report consistent across layers, so the technical detail expands the summary rather than contradicting it. If you can retrieve these reporting elements quickly, you are much less likely to write a report that becomes a confusing history lesson. You also become better at speaking clearly during briefings, because the same structure that supports reporting supports live updates. For remediation, retrieval practice should target the difference between fixing symptoms and fixing root causes, because that distinction collapses easily under pressure. You can practice recalling what evidence-driven remediation means, such as tying changes to specific findings and to outcomes that reduce recurrence. You can practice recalling that remediation often has phases, where immediate protective actions reduce harm, while deeper fixes address the conditions that allowed the incident. You can practice recalling the importance of distinguishing cause, root cause, and contributing factors, because those layers guide what you fix first and what you plan for later. You can also practice recalling the risk of guessing, especially when leaders demand a quick explanation of cause, and how to communicate uncertainty responsibly. Another powerful retrieval prompt is to ask what residual risk remains after remediation and how you would describe it without either exaggerating or dismissing it. Remediation is not only a technical act, it is a risk reduction act, and retrieval practice helps you keep that framing even when the incident is exhausting. Closure retrieval practice should focus on the idea that closure is a controlled transition, not a relief announcement. You can practice recalling what closure criteria should include, such as evidence that the threat is contained, that attacker access is removed, that critical recovery validation is complete, and that monitoring is in place to detect relapse. You can practice recalling why sign-offs matter, because they create shared accountability and prevent later claims that someone was not informed or did not agree. You can practice recalling what final documentation must contain, including the narrative, timeline, decisions, evidence handling summary, remediation actions, and follow-up ownership. A particularly useful prompt is to practice describing residual risk and outstanding work at closure, because many incidents fail here when teams pretend everything is finished. You can also practice recalling that closure includes reviewing temporary measures made during the incident, like emergency access or exceptions, and deciding whether to roll them back or formalize them. If you can retrieve these closure elements, you are less likely to close early or to leave invisible risk behind. Closure done well protects the organization as much as containment does, just in a different way. Process improvement retrieval practice should target the move from vague intention to specific change. You can practice recalling the 3 improvement goals: reduce friction, increase speed, and raise quality, and you can test yourself on what those goals look like in real incident behavior. Reducing friction often means clarifying roles, improving handoffs, and ensuring access to evidence and contacts. Increasing speed often means improving escalation triggers, decision flow, and readiness so the team does not invent everything during the incident. Raising quality often means improving communication discipline, evidence handling, recovery validation, and documentation so the response is defensible and repeatable. A key retrieval point is that good improvement is evidence-based, meaning it comes from what actually slowed or harmed the response, not from general opinions about security. Another retrieval point is avoiding the trap of adding heavy process in the name of quality, because that can slow response and increase confusion. You can practice recalling how to design improvements that make the right behavior easier rather than harder. Finally, you can practice recalling follow-through, because improvements that are not owned and tracked become forgotten promises. To make this review more realistic, it helps to practice retrieval in the form of short decision explanations, because leaders often ask questions that force you to synthesize under pressure. For example, you might practice answering why the incident is not ready to close even though services are restored, using closure criteria language rather than vague caution. You might practice answering why you cannot confirm the root cause yet, while still explaining what evidence you are gathering and what protective remediation is already in place. You might practice answering what the most important corrective actions are and how you know they matter based on evidence. You might also practice answering what changed after the incident, which forces you to link reporting, remediation, and improvement into one coherent narrative. These prompts train you to retrieve not only facts, but also disciplined phrasing, which is what prevents overconfidence and guessing. Under stress, your brain tends to compress language, and compression can distort meaning. Retrieval practice teaches you to keep meaning intact even when you must speak quickly. Tracking your retrieval practice for these phases should include a focus on language discipline, because language is the mechanism that carries your mental model to other people. You should track whether you used certainty words without evidence, whether you accidentally blurred impact and cause, whether you treated closure as a feeling rather than as criteria, and whether you described improvements vaguely. You should also track whether you maintained a stable structure in your explanations, such as consistently stating what is confirmed, what is being assessed, and what actions are underway. Stability is valuable because it reduces confusion and reduces message drift. Another useful tracking element is speed with accuracy, because incidents do not give you unlimited time, but accuracy is still essential. If you find that you can answer correctly, but only with long pauses, you can practice timed retrieval. If you find that you answer quickly, but with sloppy assumptions, you can slow down and focus on evidence language. This tracking turns practice into a targeted improvement plan for your own performance. As you finish this spaced retrieval review, remember the central promise of this learning method. What you can retrieve reliably under imperfect conditions is what you can use in a real incident. Reporting, remediation, closure, and process improvement are the phases where organizations often lose discipline because the initial emergency is fading, but the risk is still real. By practicing retrieval, assessing weak points, and tracking stability, you build a durable ability to write and speak in evidence-driven, decision-ready language. That ability protects you from guessing, protects the organization from premature closure, and protects improvement work from being forgotten. Over time, this kind of practice makes you a steadier responder because you can produce the right distinctions and the right structure even when you are tired and pressured. Incidents will always contain uncertainty, but your communication and decision discipline does not have to be uncertain. If you keep practicing spaced retrieval across these phases, you will not just remember the material. You will be able to perform it. And performance is what matters when real people, real services, and real trust are on the line.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.